Good morning, grade 9s, or good afternoon, or good evening, whichever one applies to you at this point in time. Let's take a look at lesson 4 of our biology unit today. First thing we're going to point out on this PowerPoint is that there is a series of homework questions that you can answer for practice. Hopefully it helps. If you do have your textbook available to you, I want to make sure that you're keeping up with those questions. Okay. Today we're talking about populations and resources. Okay, so we use the term population a lot. What does population actually mean? Population means the individuals of a species that occupy a particular geographic region at a certain time. And so we define what a population is. If I said, what's the population of human beings in Canada? Well, there's our geographic region, and you might say 35 million or so. Okay, if I said, what's the population of humans in the world? I'm changing the geographic region, and so you might say 7.5 billion, give or take. Okay, and the same is true for organisms. We could say, what's the population of ladybugs, or what's the population of oak trees, or what's the population of caribou, or whatever species you want, but we have to define the geographic area that we're talking about. Okay, we could say, what's the population of raccoons in Canada? Or we could say, what's the population of raccoons in Hamilton? And that would be a different answer. Okay, so we define the region that we're talking about. Okay, now populations increase when individuals reproduce at rates that are greater than what is needed to replace individuals that have left the area or died. I think that makes sense. When birth and immigration are greater than death and emigration, we get population growth. And you might have learned something like that in geography in terms of the way it applies to humans. And it's a very, very similar concept for organisms. I won't say animals because I don't mean just animals, I mean organisms. Could be bacteria even. It could be bugs, insects, spiders, arachnids, okay? Now, we're going to talk about something called exponential growth, which, if you have been paying attention to the news, then you know something about exponential growth. And what exponential growth means is it's accelerating growth. It's growth that produces a J-shaped curve. And I've got a picture on a later slide that I'm going to show you. But I think that because of what's been going on with the COVID-19 crisis, we've probably all seen an exponential growth graph. In that case, we're talking about how many people are infected with the COVID-19 virus and have been tested, and that's looking like an exponential graph, which is very, very scary at this point in time. But in general, when we look at populations, that exponential growth is very common in specific conditions, and it's usually only for a short amount of time. Now, what causes populations to grow that quickly? What causes growth that is accelerating? In other words, the rate at which something is growing is increasing. Well, when new organisms arrive in a habitat that has a lot of resources, in other words, a lot of water and food and shelter, all of the things that that organism might require to survive. When there's an abundance of that, the population is going to grow very, 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 very fast. Okay. The other condition would be that the pressures on a population are removed. So in other words, perhaps competition with another species for the same resources, that other species is removed, or predation. You know, if you took wolves out of the equation, then rabbits would reproduce and grow even more exponentially than they already do. Okay, so the conditions for that exponential growth have to be particularly specific. In the case of exponential growth with regards to viral infections, why is this particular virus growing exponentially? It's growing exponentially because very few of us have any immunity. And so we tend to get infected very easily with it. And so there's a lot of people for the virus to get infected. In other words, there is an abundance of resources for whatever this virus needs. Okay, now we don't want to get into the details of viral reproduction because that's a little bit different than, it's a different branch of biology than the population that we're studying now, but just in the principle of what makes things grow really, really quick when the things that they need to grow are in abundance, and when the things that would prevent them from growing don't exist or are removed. Okay. So if we look at this graph here, the first example is about elephants in Africa. Now, elephants were hunted for a long, long time. They were hunted for ivory. Ivory is the material that their tusks are made of. It's a white material. But in order to get it, you couldn't just cut the tusks off. You had to kill the whole elephant just for the ivory tusks to make whatever out of them, whether it's sculptures or who knows. And around the 1960s, people started to realize, well, maybe this isn't right to be hunting elephants just for the ivory tusks. Doesn't seem like a fair thing to do. And so there were laws put in place that protected elephants in 1960. So if we look at the graph that's given on this slide, it says population growth of elephants in South Africa's Kruger National Park. Okay, population is on the y-axis. Year is on the x-axis. At 1960, when those protections go in place, in other words, the protections remove something that had been preventing population growth. They remove the poachers that were hunting elephants for their tusks. Okay, you remove that. What happens to the growth of the species? Well, the population spikes almost straight up, and so that backwards J shape that we see on the graph. Okay, sorry, not backwards J shape. That's regular J shape, that is exponential growth. So it almost spikes almost vertically, not quite vertically, pretty close to vertically straight up. Okay, that's your exponential growth. Okay, now turkeys, okay, we eat them obviously, but I don't think very many of us have seen wild turkeys, and really, we don't really encounter them in our everyday lives. But what we have been doing for a long, long time is cutting down forests, okay, and hunting turkeys. And in the 90s, what they decided to do is take turkeys and introduce them in areas that had resources, okay, that could support the turkey populations. And when they deliberately brought the turkeys to these areas that had forests and had resources, what they found is their populations grew exponentially as well. And that's not because we removed something, but because we introduced the turkeys into a habitat that had all the resources they needed to survive without our intervention. And so that population exploded too exponentially. Okay. Now, we need to talk about limiting factors. That exponential growth, that sharp vertical, almost vertical growth cannot continue forever, okay? Because there are not unlimited resources, okay? That term resources, things that we use to survive, it's such a broad term, okay? For us, resources mean one thing. For organisms, resources might mean another. There's probably a little bit of overlap, but they are the things that organisms need to survive. And there are not infinite amounts of these resources. Okay, so limiting factors are factors that restrict or limit growth, okay, or the distribution or the amount of the population, and they have to do with resources that become unavailable. Okay, so if we look at the table on this slide, there are important abiotic limiting factors that affect the population. Okay, things like space. Animals need a certain amount of space. Organisms need a certain amount of space. Plants need a certain amount of space to survive. Plants in particular need light. Okay, you might say, well, there's an unlimited amount of light, but that's not 100% true. Tall trees block out the light from hitting smaller plants, and so light can be limited. Okay, water is a limiting factor. Okay, there are lots of water, but there's not an infinite amount of water. That can be a limiting factor. Temperature or acidity can be limiting factors. If temperature rises too high, okay, if temperature rises too high, that might stop population growth. If the acidity, like we talked about in previous lessons, rises to a certain pH or lowers to a certain pH, organisms may not be able to survive as well as they could. We talked about how organisms need oxygen. If we run out of oxygen, in a certain ecosystem, like perhaps a lake that's undergoing rapid algae growth, well, then other species are going to die out. Okay. Urban sprawl is something I particularly want to talk about, because what urban sprawl means is the places where we live, our cities and our towns, okay, when they grow larger, they grow larger into space that was once a natural ecosystem. And as our cities and towns grow larger, they eliminate that natural space for animals to live in. Okay, and we call that urban sprawl. That's us encroaching on the space of other organisms and where they need to live. And so they don't have as many places to live. And so obviously those ecosystems can't support as many individuals in the population as they might have before we showed up. Okay, and those are abiotic factors because they're not necessarily things that are alive. They certainly have an impact on living things, but they're not alive. The big biotic limiting factors are predation and competition. In other words, things that want to eat you, okay, and things that want to eat the same things you want to eat or use the same resources you want to use. Okay. So carrying capacity is like the maximum. Okay, if we look at an ecosystem, we say, what is the maximum amount of individuals that can be supported in this particular ecosystem? What's the maximum size of the population? Okay, if you go above that carrying capacity, well, no additional individuals can be supported. Okay, when a population is maintained at carrying capacity, the size of the population is at equilibrium or balance. That doesn't mean that organisms aren't born and organisms don't die. What it means is that the number of organisms that die is the same as the number of organisms that are born. Okay, that's what equilibrium means. It means, yes, the population in general is staying at the same number, okay, but it's only because individuals are dying at the same rate that they're born. Okay. Now, that means the number of individuals stays close to the same, but that means individuals are dying and are being born. Okay. Now, that equilibrium can be disrupted, and there's an example there. Okay. And sometimes carrying capacity can be exceeded, and that can have a negative repercussion on the population. Now, here's an example. We're looking at the fur trade. Okay. In the 1800s, the fur trade led to a drastic reduction in the fur seal population. So the seals that we were hunting for their fur, okay, we were hunting them so well that we radically declined the population. And so what that led to was a treaty to conserve wildlife. Okay. And so as a result, the fur seal underwent exponential growth. So you can see that in the graph on this page. There's that increasing slope. That's what we would consider the exponential growth. The population is growing really fast, but that population hits a carrying capacity where the graph kind of plateaus. And it says, okay, well, it looks like the maximum amount of fur seals living in this particular geographic area, okay, is around 9,000. In this case, we're talking about breeding male fur seals. So we're looking at just the males that have breeding capabilities, that have mating capabilities. And the maximum there is 9,000. And we're not going to see more than 9,000, or it might be a little bit more than 9,000 individuals, because the ecosystem can't support more than that. Okay. Now, humans alter natural ecosystems to suit our needs. Okay. So it's hard to say that humans have a carrying capacity, because we're constantly looking at environments and saying, well, we can change this environment to make it more comfortable for us. If a place is too cold, we build heating systems. If a place is too warm, we build air conditioning. If a place doesn't have enough clean water, we build filtration systems. If a place doesn't have enough food, we can work the land and irrigate the land and farm. Okay, and we can constantly change our environment. Okay. Now, urban sprawl is how we gradually change different environments to suit us. Urban sprawl is about the edges of urban areas. So it's almost at like the city limits. Okay. And gradually over years or decades, cities will grow gradually larger and larger and larger and larger by building new homes and then new businesses. Okay. Now that means we're depending on automobiles to get around. We don't have as much farmland. Okay. And then most importantly, those native species that would have been in that area, well, we're ruining their ecosystem. We're saying we want to build houses here. So all the owls or squirrels or raccoons or birds or whomever was living in this area, they got to go. But there's only so much land on planet Earth. So as we sprawl out our space all over the globe, we tend to push these natural ecosystems, we push their carrying capacity down because we take up all the space. What happens to those animals? What happens to those plants? What happens to those organisms? Do they survive? Probably not. Now, one thing that we've done here in Ontario is we've tried to reduce urban sprawl, and the process is called intensification. So what the city, in particular the city of Hamilton, has done this, is they've said, we're not going to approve any more land to build on, to build let's say residential homes on. And so if you go to the edges of the city, it's very rare that you'll find land that you can just buy and build homes on. Okay. Instead, what you'll notice if you go around the city, there are a lot of condo developments going up. And that's because we can't use any more land to build new things and new land to build things on. So we've got to use existing land and build taller buildings on it. Okay. Because those condos, they're within the boundaries of the city, but they're built up, okay, like apartment complexes, okay? And so that way, maybe it's something positive. I mean, I don't know how well that works, really, but we are conserving land. We're not infringing on natural ecosystems or farmland in that way, at the very least. So you can see in that picture, there's a building with 3 stories, and then in the next picture, because you can't build houses anywhere else, instead you'll just build apartments in another 2 floors on the top of that building. And that way you can fit more homes without having to use more land. Okay, so that's what we're talking about when we talk about intensification. And I hope this lesson wasn't too long, but that is our very quick lesson on population dynamics. It's something that you will touch on again a little bit later in this course, and then once again in grade 12 biology. Or if you choose to take the AP course in the summer, we will talk a little bit more about population dynamics in the summer. Okay, so for those of you that are thinking about taking that, we are in the process of making sure we can offer that course, and hopefully we do. I'm 99% sure we will. So look out for that as we approach summer. Okay, until next time, everybody stay healthy and stay safe.